Okay, well, I hope you can all hear me well, and please wave yes, so sort of. I need to get close to the. Is this better? Yeah. Okay. I'll try to speak in the microphone, and otherwise just wave, and I will get closer to the microphone. So thanks a lot. I'm very happy to be able to give a talk today, and it is based upon my inaugural lecture. That is for the largest part in Dutch, but there's an English summary. And I was wondering who is able to read Dutch in this. So, okay. Yeah, okay. So I do have an impression of the people who have been able to read Dutch. So, as I mentioned, I'm very grateful for this opportunity, because the strange thing with inaugural lectures is that you do not really discuss them with your colleagues at the moment that you give them. So this is my first exchange with students about my ideas. So I'm very happy. And would like to thank Renee and Joshua and Daniel for inviting me for this course. So what I will do in this presentation is present the main ideas. I've added some examples, and I will mainly also explain the part on hermeneutics, because that wasn't part of the English summary. I guess I will need half an hour to 45 minutes to give my presentation, and then afterwards we can have a discussion. So let's see whether this works. Yeah. So the field of my chair is philosophical anthropology. And my claim is that philosophical anthropology of the 21st century should address the question of the embodiment of personal identity and how it is given meaning in the social world around us. So I hold the two philosophers on the slide for the two most important philosophical anthropologists of the 20th century. Their work, and in Hannah Arendt's case, that is mainly the human condition from 1958. And in Ricoeur's case, it is his early book, Fallible Man, published in 1960, and also his book on personal identity, Oneself as Another, that was published in 1990 in French. So these two philosophers explain philosophical anthropology not in terms of essences of human beings, but more in terms of action and creation. And the words of Hannah Arendt that in the human condition, that we are conditioned beings, but that we create our conditions ourselves, so that we are on the one hand creating the conditions that we live in, but that we on the other hand also are conditioned by these conditions. That summarizes this idea best, I think. So, my problem with these thinkers, so I sort of use their work, but I also try to take steps ahead of them. So my main problem is with these thinkers is that when it comes to thinking about personal identity, they consider the who-ness of a person as that something that is more important than their what-ness. And in itself, I do not have any problems with that, because I do believe that they're right. But in the present circumstances, the Me Too affair, the problems around sexism, but also Black Lives Matter, for instance. Imply that it is also a person's whatness that is important to reflect upon. So before we can consider the who-ness of a person, we need to take into consideration the person's whatness. So discrimination on the basis of gender or race makes that a person's who-ness cannot be articulated. cannot come into the open, and therefore we need to, as philosophers, we need to consider the whatness of a person. So my claim is on the side that philosophical anthropology of the 21st century needs to consider gender, race, sexual orientations, that is, these as the aspects of personal identity that are embodied and that situate a person in the social world. And in the lecture, of course, I concentrate on gender. And I'm arguing three things that are on the slide. So instead of understanding gender in terms of the sex-gender distinction, which is the most common distinction that is made nowadays, also consider personal identity. And in the Dutch version, I introduced the notion of geslacht, the Dutch notion of geslacht, as a notion that incorporates the three elements, but I will not discuss that today. The second thesis is that in the current debate, there's often a distinction and an opposition created between cisgender and transgender. But my claim is that instead of opposing these two, we should consider trans as thematizing what remains unthematized in cisgender. And the third part that I will concentrate on today is the philosophical approach to think about gender. And my suggestion is to use hermeneutics, and I will discuss the instrument, the tools that hermeneutics offers in order to analyze gender. So first, a few terms that I use. Perhaps not everyone is acquainted with these terms. So the term transgender refers to a person whose gender identity does not correspond to the sex assigned to them at birth. Cisgender refers, it's a new term that has come up as a consequence of the use of transgender. A cisgender refers to a person whose gender identity does correspond to the sex assigned at birth. And then there's a term gender dysphoria, which is a more medical term. It's a term that is used in the diagnostic statistical manual, and that designates the incongruence between sex. Oh, I see there's a mistake because my computer sort of makes adjust the letters. So sex should be with an X. Between sex assigned at birth and the gender identity that is experienced later in life. So in this gender dysphoria definition, you find the problematic aspects, the psychological problematic aspects of not coinciding with the gender that was assigned to you at birth. So these are the main terms. And I would like to start with my first argument. That is that I argued that for taking into consideration personal identity instead of only, so let's take a look back, instead of only thinking in terms of sex and gender. And therefore, I would like to take a look at this definition. I've taken this from a slide from the site of the World Health Organization. And my point is not that the World Health Organization does not have a good definition of gender, but the point is that it is a very unclear definition of what gender implies. So let's take a look at the slide. It says gender refers to the characteristics of women, men, girls, and boys that are socially constructed. This includes norms, behaviors, roles associated with being a woman, a man, girl, or boy, as well as relationships with each other. As a social construct, gender varies from society to society and can change over time. So this first in first instance, the WHO defines gender in terms of being a social construct. Well, the next section is about intersectionality. We are skipping that one. But then if we take a look at the third section, it says gender interacts with, but is different from sex, which is, of course, already a problem, which refers to the different biological and physiological characteristics of females, males, and intersex persons. And then they explain it. Gender and sex are related to, but different from, gender identity. Well, and then I'm totally confused as a because here gender identity is considered as something else than gender. And gender identity next is referred to as a person's deeply felt internal and individual experience of gender. So the point is that gender gets two main meanings in this definition of the World Health Organization. And if you look at other definitions, you will probably also find these two aspects of gender. So gender is a social construct, and it also pertains to identity. Well, I would like to give a bit of background for these notions of gender, because they are related to different theoretical ideas and usages. And my point is not that the WHO is wrong or is confusing, but I do think that when you all put all these notions of gender together, then it becomes a sort of total mess. And that is what's, so I do think that this site is very well informed, but it does not solve the problems that we with this notion of gender identity. So let's take a look at the background of these different usages of the notion of gender. The notion of gender is coined in the 50s and 60s by psychologists such as John Money and Robert Stoller. They treated people with what we would now call trans people who didn't understand their own identity as similar to the sex that was assigned to them at birth. So they needed another notion than the notion of sex, and they coined this notion of gender. And in this case, of course, gender refers to gender identity. Then in the 70s, feminists took over this distinction, but with a totally different aim. So the feminists of the second wave take over this distinction in order to differentiate between the material body and social roles and responsibilities. So, and the aim of these feminists was to prevent biological determinism. So they didn't want, so they wanted to avoid the argument that because of their capacity to give birth to children, women would also be held responsible for taking care of the children. So the social roles and responsibilities should not be related to the material body. And that is where this idea of gender as a social construct comes from. So that are the two different backgrounds of the notion of gender. And what happens in the 90s of the last century is that this distinction in family theory in gender studies is criticized because it is such an unclear distinction. And because it is claimed that the two are implicated in each other, so that for instance, behavior, smoking behavior, eating behavior influences your body, or so your body is not something that is material and that is not affected by gender, but it is affected. So there are interactions, interrelations between the two. And another point is that gender has so many different interpretations, from gendered division of labor to identity, that it's a very unclear term. And the alternative that is now the prevailing theory within gender studies when it comes to gender identity is the notion of gender that Judith Butler developed. So let's take a brief look at that. This is a very nice picture of Butler. So Butler's theory of performativity, and so she uses the notion performativity of John Austin. But she understands that in a manner, in a Derridian manner. If you want me to explain that, I can do so after the talk. But let's take a look at what she means with performativity. So her theory of performativity is widely accepted nowadays, and it means that gender is the outcome of a process of citation and repetition of existing social norms. So the idea is that we come to understand ourselves within a social, cultural, historical order in which there are already regulative, normative practices of gender, and that we repeat these practices in giving ourselves an identity. So, and also, what I also find important, because Butler is criticized a lot for not taking into account the body, but I do think that she does refer to the body. Also our bodies acquire an identity through this series of actions that are constantly renewed and revised and also consolidated over time. So for Butler at large, gender is not what we are, but a sort of biological part of who we are, but it is what we do. It's about acting. And her thinking is often called social constructivist, but I don't think that is a very adequate designation of what her theory comes, or what her theory implies. Because often social constructivism is interpreted as excluding the body, as I just mentioned. So Butler's point is that the body is part of these processes of social and linguistic signification. For instance, the example I always give is that when someone enters the door here, we sort of immediately categorize that body. And another example is that if you have two babies and put them on a table and compare them to each other, then there are very many different distinctions between these babies. The one cries harder than the other one. The one has more hair, or the skin color may differ. But there's only one distinction that we sort of immediately impose upon these bodies, and that is gender. So is it a girl or is it a boy? And that is the process of boying and girling, which according to Butler is a social and cultural form of giving signification, instead of it being something that is essential to these bodies. So in that sense, she said bodies materialize as male or female. So Butler's claim at large is that gender can, so she broadens the notion of gender. Gender is the apparatus or the mechanism that also brings forth sex. So this is only a short account of Butler's theory, because also desire is an aspect of her theory, but this is sufficient for my argument. So, so the point I was making is that instead of only thinking in terms of sex and gender, also identity should be taken into account. But in order to make that point, we need to take a look at the second argument, and that is that instead of opposing cis and transgender, we should consider trans in terms of thematizing what remains unthematized in cisgender. And for that, to make that argument, I have another example. So the point is that cis and trans are not opposed to each other, but that they are well, similar to each other when it comes to the aspects that are relevant for gender. So, so I would like to take a look at trans experiences, and in order to make that point, and I refer to a work that is called Documenting Dysphoria. You can find it on the internet. So if you type in Google or elsewhere Documenting Dysphoria and the name of WISMA, you will immediately find the site. And Documenting Dysphoria is are portraits of trans people that are made by a Korean Californian photographer that is called Wisma. The aim of these portraits is, so it are photos and short texts, and the aim is to make to give visibility to these experiences and thereby reduce social misunderstanding. So instead, and what I find striking in some of the quotes is that instead of speaking of gender dysphoria, these people speak of make a distinction between social dysphoria and body dysphoria. So let's take a look at the quote of Mira, who says, "I'm a binary transgender woman. So for me, there's the social dysphoria and the body dysphoria. Those are really the two components. I've noticed, at least in my experience, that one or the other is stronger in different people. For me, it means that mixture of not only being able to live as your gender in the world, which is a social aspect, but also just that basic discongruence with your body itself." So, and Mira is not the only one. Also, Valerie in these quotes makes a similar distinction. So I would like to add that it is that this basic discongruence with your body can take different forms. For instance, there's also Taylor in these portraits who says that he only started having trouble with his body when he began using contraception. At that point, his body feminized and he began to feel increasingly uncomfortable. And from the moment onwards that he began to use testosterone and his body became more masculine, and he actually began to love it again. So it can also appear later in life and is not well, so it differs. The amount of feeling discongruent with your body differs, and also when that happens in life. So, but my point was that, so you have this social dysphoria, body dysphoria, and as you can see in this quote, there's a distinction between I and then the body and the social environment. So my point is that trans entails an experience of one's body, of the way a person is named and seen in their social environment, and a sense of self. that differs from that. So it has these three components, and the point is that this goes for cis as well, but in the cis case, the three coincide. So the way I understand my body is in line with the sex that was assigned to me at birth, and also with the way people name me and consider my identity. So this is a conclusion of the first part, the first two arguments. So the idea is that trans people experience fractures with parts of their own body and with the way the social environment names and perceives them. And cisgender means that you coincide with the gender that is assigned to you at birth. But the components of the two are not different. So in that sense, they are not opposed, but both are, well, you could almost say, and that is what Butler says in one of the latest articles, is that they are both variations of gender. Okay. So my third argument is about hermeneutics. So let's take a look at that. So this is about a philosophical approach to analyze gender. I will very briefly explain what hermeneutics entails, because I do think that you should be aware of that. So hermeneutics is the ancient doctrine of interpretation. And so my starting point in hermeneutics is in 20th century hermeneutics, and that means the hermeneutics that has taken what is called an ontological turn. And that means that hermeneutics is not only about interpretation anymore, but that it is, and it's also not limited to the interpretation of texts, but people are seen as interpreting beings who give meaning to their environment by acting. So, and that is the turn that hermeneutics took after Heidegger, and that is continued also by Hans-Georg Gadamer, who wrote Truth and Method, and there withdraws the contours of a philosophical hermeneutics. And for Gadamer, hermeneutical understanding is linguistically mediated. Language plays an important role in his Truth and Method. It forms the horizon for human understanding and therewith for hermeneutics. So, and of particular relevance, I already named him in the beginning. Of particular relevance to my project is the work of Paul Ricoeur, who relates hermeneutics to self-interpretation and to personal identity. So human understanding is not only understanding the world or a text or whatever, but it also entails self-understanding. So there's a sort of intrinsic link between self-understanding and understanding the world for Ricoeur, and that self-understanding takes place through symbols. And that has different implications. In the first place, it means that we express ourselves in language, as well as in art and in institutions. In everything that we create, we express ourselves, and thereby explain and express who we are. And the second implication is that the only way to understand ourselves is also through those expressions. So for Ricoeur, personal identity is narrative identity. You express who you are in language, well, we'll get back to that. So that is in a general sense about hermeneutics. Of course, my concern is not so much with personal identity in a general sense, but with embodied identity that situates us in a social, cultural, historical context. And in itself, I must admit that the philosophical school of hermeneutics does not pay much attention to this. So Gadamer did write a small book about medicine and about what he calls the enigma of the body. And Ricoeur manages the body and considers us as embodied beings, but he does not develop a philosophy of the body. So that is the work that we still need to do. But I do consider hermeneutics relevant for thinking about gender identity, and that is for these three reasons that I would like to go through. So the first one is the idea that we are embedded in a social, historical, and linguistic context. On top of this slide is what I mentioned in the beginning, the idea of being conditioned, that of Hannah Arendt. So, and if you take a look at gender identity, and apply this idea to gender identity, then it becomes easy to understand that these common binary terms, male and female, nowadays turn out to be a straitjacket for many people. That straitjacket, the binary distinction male-female, is something that we created ourselves through history, with the help of language and also through social power mechanisms. So it is not a sort of essence of what being human entails, but it is a historical construct. So, so understanding this historical formation of these categories, man and woman, and the exclusion that goes together with them, makes it possible to no longer regard them as natural or essential categories, and it creates space for new terms and categories. And well, within hermeneutics, you find different ways of understanding discourse. In Ricoeur's work, the main idea of Ricoeur is that discourse forms a laboratory of possibilities for representing identity. So we addresses novels, for instance, that give us other representations of identity, and that in that sense he considers novels as as new representations of identity, and but when you compare that to the position of Judith Butler, as I've done in many articles, for Butler also used this notion of discourse, but for Butler, discourse excludes, and it identifies and it excludes at the same time. So, and my point in this respect is that we need both aspects. Ricoeur's idea of the possibility that discourse offers to give new representations, but also Butler's idea. So the multiplicity of terms to signify one's gender that you see happening nowadays. My students, for instance, I'm teaching a course that is called Theorizing Gender and Intersectionality, and the students constantly claim that what is important is that we find new terms to address masculinity and femininity. And this constant renewal of language also multiplies possibilities for identification, but we should also keep an open eye to the exclusion that language can imply. So that is the first point. And the second one is about the importance of self-interpretation. I already mentioned that for Ricoeur, interpreting includes self-understanding. But that happens within this framework of the social, cultural, historical context that was mentioned in the first point. And that means that we have a mediated understanding of ourselves, but it also implies the possibility of bringing forward one's own description of who one is. So, and when you apply that to, for instance, to the transgender law, the recent discussion about the transgender law, in the political debate about it, there's the question is to what extent are people and from what age onwards are people allowed to modify their gender identity in their passport without consultation with a medical specialist or psychologist. But if you put that in a hermeneutic light, it involves the question of the relationship between the gender that is assigned to a person at birth by others versus by an individual, him or herself, or themselves. So, and the question becomes, to what extent do we consider people capable of determining for themselves who they are and allow a person, and to what extent do we allow a person to determine their own gender identity? So is it the case that we allow the gender determined at birth by others to prevail, or do we also allow room for an individual's own definition of identity, and to what extent are medical specialists necessary in order to inform a person about that? So the point is not that I think that we should, because this discussion often goes in the direction of being able to choose your identity. And I agree very much with Butler that it is within this social, cultural, historical context in which there are already specific representations of gender that we define our gender identity. But I would like to create some space for self-determination and for the ability of to determine one's own gender, so that people, as Mira said in that earlier quote, can live as that gender in this world. Okay, third point is about the narrative account of identity. I do think that hermeneutics, and especially recursive hermeneutics, provides a philosophical tool to express gendered identity. As I mentioned, Paul Ricoeur sees personal identity as something that is constituted in a life story, and that life story has the components, has the characteristics that are applied. It is a somewhat coherent configuration. It gives coherence to life events. It is a sort of organizing principle that you use in order to make decisions, take big decisions in life. It is something that it's not told at one certain moment in life, but it is something that evolves. And it also contains stories of others. So that is a very brief definition of narrative identity for Ricoeur. And what I found striking is that in the field of transgender studies, in the work of the main protagonist in the field, you find this notion of narrative. For instance, in the work of Susan Stryper, but also in, and perhaps that is closer to my project, in the work of Jay Prosser, who argues that regendering a transgender body includes a bodily transition, but that another narrative about oneself precedes that bodily transition. And well, what I explain in the lecture is also that the consideration of the body that you can find in Ricoeur, and that is a bit technical to explain now, can be used because, and the main point is that for Ricoeur, our body is not mainly our own. It is not only the way we experience ourselves, but it is also, it has this sort of objective between brackets side in that it situates us between other bodies. So my body is at once my own and a body among other bodies. And this idea of being a body among other bodies is important in order to understand trans embodiment. Because the body is also something that is seen and that is considered and named by others. Well, I sort of hesitate whether I should take a look at the last few slides, because the last few are about how this hermeneutical approach to gender identity relates to Butler and to another important school that is emerging nowadays, that is critical phenomenology.
So
yeah,
we have a session till 11:30. So if you continue for 15 more minutes, and we have only
15. Okay, well, I do not need that much time anymore.
Then we have some 25 minutes for Q&A. That doesn't seem appropriate.
Okay, so that is the last part of my the final part of my lecture. So the question is, so how I already mentioned hermeneutics. The main philosophers in hermeneutics, Gadamer and Ricoeur, do not really develop a philosophy of the body. So why turn to hermeneutics, except for these arguments, instead of taking a look at Butler's theory, who of course did develop this theory about gender identity. And what you see nowadays is also a school that is called critical phenomenology, that is basically that uses Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology in order to reflect on questions around gender and around race. For instance, for the ones who are a bit acquainted with that field, you have the work of Sarah Heinema. Maren Weerle in Rotterdam is working on in this field. And when it comes to race, I'm thinking of Helen Nago, who wrote about habit and racism. So there are all kinds of new developments in phenomenology. So why would I suggest hermeneutics instead of critical phenomenology and instead of Butler's theory? So let's take a look. So I do think that Butler's theory is convincing insofar as it interprets gender as a radically social, as something that is radically social, linguistic, and historical. And I also like this idea of gender as doing. And I also think that is the second point, that Butler develops the normative aspects of gendered embodiment better than a hermeneutic approach can offer. There have been discussions about power and hermeneutics, for instance, when it comes to Gadamer's work. So instead of replacing Butler's theory, I think that it should be complemented, and that this hermeneutic approach can offer some tools to complement Butler's theory. So because Butler's theory does remain rather general and it does not specify the material aspects of gender, the more biological aspects, and it also does not work out the experience of embodiment and the individual process of acquiring a gendered identity. So It may be that gender comes about in a performative process of assumption and repetition of social norms, but how does this personal relationship to these norms come about that ultimately leads to a gendered identity? And that is where I think this notion of narrative identity might offer a solution. So, and when it comes to critical phenomenology, hermeneutics, of course, is related to phenomenology. So Ricoeur has written this famous piece on phenomenology and hermeneutics, in which he argues for hermeneutics and sort of takes a distance from phenomenology, but still hermeneutics as a school has evolved from phenomenology, and Ricoeur also still refers to phenomenology when it comes to his account of the body. So there's a close relationship between the two, and I would like to maintain that close relationship. So but there are some ideas that there are some ideas in phenomenology that I would like to take into account. So at large, I think that hermeneutics does a better job in considering human beings as embedded within a social, cultural, and historical context. And so the accounts of, for instance, in critical phenomenology, you find these theories about gender and race, but they all focus upon embodiment. I do think that in hermeneutics, so this aspect of being embodied in social order is dealt with in a better way. But there's something else that we can learn from phenomenology. So I would argue for also considering these schools as complementing each other. And that is that in Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology of perception, he shows that these social, cultural, historical significations that surround us and in which we define our identity, that they shouldn't be considered as a sort of determining whole that we cannot relate to. But for Merleau-Ponty, there's also always an interrelationship between these representations, these existing representations, and the person that is using them. So we are surrounded by this social environment and by what he calls sedimented language, but we also relate to this, and that implies that we draw from it in order to understand ourselves, that we can add meaning to it, but also that we can withdraw from it and experience that the existing words and concepts do not correspond to who we are. So as people that do not coincide with their birth facts, of course, experience. So, and that is an aspect that you find worked out in phenomenology to a larger extent. So to conclude, my claim is that gender is a complex interaction between body, identity, and the social environment. Hermeneutics of the body implies at large a continuation and completion of the ideas that are already developed in Butler's post-structuralism and also in critical phenomenology. But it adds the consideration of individual gendered identity in the case of Butler, and to phenomenology it in a more radical sense think through the social, linguistic, and historical signification of the body. So well, this is my conclusion, and to explain a bit what I mean with this complex interaction. It's not the case that these three components can be reduced to each other, and that there's that they do not differ from each other. So the point is that the body does not coincide with the individual or social signification of it. One's own experience or identity does not do so with the way a person is named and perceived in the social environment. I think that the questions that we currently face in theorizing about gender are precisely how these connections work and how they interrelate. So, and that means that this project includes a multidisciplinary approach in which biology plays a part, the developmental psychology when it comes to the emergence of gender identity, phenomenology, and gender theory. So we need all of these different approaches in order to find out what these complex interactions come down to. I do have some suggestions to that, but we can discuss them in the
Q&A.
Q&A. Yes.
So thanks very much for this. I've got some 25 minutes for questions. You're not running away, aren't you?
No. Just.
So, are there any people who want to raise their hand to indicate that they want to engage in discussion? Yeah. Number one and number two.
Yes, thank you for your lecture.
Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, in this lecture you said I constrain myself to gender, and now I'm also very interested in how this project of the hermeneutics of the body aspires to do justice to this intersectional perspective.
Okay.
You also mentioned this when it comes to ethnicity or race, for example, perhaps the work of Frans Fanon comes to mind.
Yeah.
But then it seems that this author would belong much more to this phenomenological school than to the hermeneutical one. And in some sense, you would recognize the value of the phenomenological tradition, but also kind of depart from it. So then, how does this approach? What would a hermeneutics of the body, which takes into account this intersectionality of personal identity, look like in your project?
Okay. Okay. So I think there are two aspects to your question. So first is intersectional approach. Of course. So I do think that for a philosophical analysis of what gender entails, what race entails, etc., and that is also what I see in critical phenomenology, is that an intersectional approach does not work. Because, well, intersectionality is basically, of course, about how we are situated within the social context and are situated on diverse axes, and so it comes closer to what identity is in real life. But for philosophical analysis, I think that we do need to focus upon this question: what is gender, what is race, etc. So yeah. So I do not doubt that there's a sort of truth to intersectionality, but philosophical analysis means that you specify and concentrate on one of these axes. And when Fanon, you mentioned Fanon, and but I do think that also in the case of Fanon, who indeed uses an existentialist phenomenological approach in order to consider race, but also in his case, he already shows that in fact he considers embodiment as situated within a social and cultural environment. So the signification of his blackness is something that comes from outside. So he uses Sartre's phenomenology, and I think Sartre's phenomenology is a social phenomenology in the sense that it's about the relationship to others. So and that is very close to hermeneutics, I would say. So yeah, that's the start of an answer.
Kato.
End of the, I think of course,
Yeah.
you said at the end of yeah, the three components that they cannot be reduced to each other.
Yes.
Now I was wondering, I don't know if you know, for example, Sanneke de Haan word.
What?
If you know Sanneke de Haan word.
Sanneke de Haan, yes. Yes.
We're not explaining the interaction between the three components.
Yeah.
And she said, well, there are just these different dimensions of something that you can see them as different foci of looking at the same emerging thing. So it's, instead of, yeah, and I was wondering like how the understanding relates to explanation versus causality.
Oh, explanation causality. So I will start with answering your question about Sanneke de Haan, because thanks for bringing that in. And well, I know her work mainly from her discussion with the phenomenologist that is called Dan Zahavi. Perhaps you've heard of him. And well, and Zahavi's point is then that when it and he's a Husserlian, so he argues that narrative identity, this notion of identity that I've been talking about, is merely the social aspect of identity, and that there's a sort of core identity that is phenomenological, and so we experience ourselves as an I, in distinction from this social environment that we are part of. So that is well, a very rough outlines the point of Zahavi, and Sanneke de Haan has taken issue with that and says, well, no, that is not the case. We experience ourselves not distinct from this social context, but also always within the social context. Are you still there, Kato? So in that respect, I think that Sanneke is her argument is very close to what I discussed, and I also wrote a piece about the Zahavi's idea about this core identity, this core self-identity, which is embodied according to him. And recursion of narrative identity, arguing that narrative that we perhaps indeed experience ourselves as an I, but that it always happens within the social context. So is that sufficient? No?
I was wondering that do you see these three components, body identity and social environment, separated by see them as important to look at the same thing that
Okay, that's a good question. Yeah, so because that makes me realize that I should reconsider this in relation, but the point that I wanted to make in the last slide was that it's not the case that there's a distinction between identity and the gender of the body. So that's the main point, but I should perhaps indeed and yeah, okay, I will think about it. Okay.
Any further questions? Yes, please.
Well, thank you for the lecture.
And let's call our names. So what's your name? Isa.
I was wondering, so you say that when someone is able, whether someone is able to determine their own gender on their passports, this depends on your capability of self-interpretation, right?
Well, so I was making an argument for self-identification, and the background of it is also these discussions. Okay.
So in this sort of discussion on determining your gender on your passport, you maybe want some sort of age from when on you can determine your gender on your passport. But then I was wondering, then you should be able to determine whether someone is capable of this self-identification or self-interpretation.
Yeah.
But then you need some, if you want to have this sort of age from when on you can do this, you need to way to determine from what age someone is sufficiently capable of this self-interpretation, maybe. And so I was wondering, how would this look, and how can you determine about someone else whether they are capable of self-interpretation?
Okay. So first about these passports, I think that the best solution would be to not have gender in the passport at all. So the problem. So why do you need gender in the passport? Is it necessary to identify a person when he, she, or they are crossing a border, for instance? I wouldn't know. So but your question is also about the age at which a person could identify himself, because that is that would be my next suggestion, that indeed a person's sex should not be given at birth to that person by other people, but that that person would be able to give assume a gender identity of their own at a certain age. So your question is what age? And that is very difficult to answer, well, because in psychological developmental psychology, there have been a lot of studies about gender identity, and the evidence shows that children from the age of 3 or 4 onwards relate the gender stereotypes and gender ideas in their environment to their own body, and that they start assuming a gender identity. And in some cases, there are a lot of examples of trans people who at a very early age, already from 3 or 4 years onwards, understand their own gender identity as a different one than they are considered in their environment. But it's also the case that example of Taylor, that for instance in puberty the body changes, and then this awareness of not coinciding with the gender identity comes about. So I would say, yeah, so it's difficult to give to name a specific age, but I would say perhaps after puberty or something like that. Yeah.
Yes, please.
First of all, thank you for the talk.
Yes.
I really enjoyed it. I'm learning a lot of stuff. So I wanted to ask about so in the last part you talked about this embedded social historical context. And then you talk about representations of identity, and you also talk about narratives. Yeah, especially on representations of identity. I am a bit confused on how do you understand them? Do you understand them as something that is also embedded and defined as something within the social context, or do you define as something that can be separated from the context and is individual and internal? I mainly make this question because I know mainly literature from embedded philosophy of mind, and they are usually against these separation, calling representations and separating it from them.
Yeah, so I would argue. So I agree with these theories about embedded cognition that you referred to. So I would definitely say that we are born within a social, cultural, historical environment, and we start developing an identity within that context. So that means that you use the representations that are available to you, and that you perhaps combine them. But well, I hesitate to distinguish a sort of inner self from these social representations. So I would rather say, and then again, I'm inspired by Butler, that for instance, the human psyche comes about in distinguishing itself and relating itself to these social structures. So the psyche is not something inner that is opposed to something outer, and it does not sort of relate to the norms in a sense that it is distant from it, but it comes about in the psyche comes about in repeating and relating to these structures. So I think it's much in line with these interactions.
So there were, I think, two questions there. You first, and then you, and then.
Thanks. My name is Joost from University. Thank you for this really interesting talk. I have a question that kind of relates both to your point about the relation between hermeneutics and phenomenology, and to what you just said about Butler's psychic life of power. My question is essentially about the possibility of withdrawing from, let's say, the interpretive context within which we live, and as you said, by which we are sort of shaped and come to understand ourselves. That if we are sort of, we are not necessarily determined, but if we come to have a self-understanding through the social, biological, just general context within which we live, then how can we withdraw from this context?
Yes, that is.
I mean, it's the question that plagues me ever since I started.
Yes, I understand. It's an intriguing question, and I do not have a clear answer to it, because, well, that is also a sort of question that is also in the background of my mind constantly. But I would say perhaps it's sooner saying no to all these representations that you are confronted with. So I'm not that label that you use to signify me. That's something else. So so in that sense, it's not a sort of core inner gender identity that you have, and I do know that many trans people do not agree with me in this respect. But I would say that it's sooner a no to these representations imposed upon you than something else.
So that's a withdrawal would also not just be just really quick follow, not just be like a complete isolation from the context, but rather maybe a negotiation with
Yeah,
context.
it's always because, and that is again, then Butler is interesting. We need social existence, so we need to be recognized by the social environment that we are part of. So, yeah, we cannot simply completely withdraw from that. Yeah. Yeah, but and this notion of withdrawal, I used it in relationship to Merleau-Ponty, and Merleau-Ponty has these examples of closing your eyes, for instance, and which is very nice. So it is not that you sort of completely disappear and take a distance from from whatever you are engaging with, but you can close your eyes for a while and
You can be less directly implicated by
Precisely. Precisely.
Yeah, also thank you for your talk. I have two different points. One is whether you would define this understanding of gender as sort of an ecology of gender or interactionist, and if so, like would the complex interaction be symmetrical, or in cases where the three components have like an asymmetric relationship to each other, then would power be a notion that you could account for, and therefore you overly go to this intersectional approach?
Yeah, so I do consider power in terms of the so it is a sort of a question that relates to Cato's question. I think, so I would definitely consider the social environment and the social context that we live in as the sort of the outer horizon of our identity, so that, and power mechanisms are part of that. Yeah, so
And do you think that, for example, social environment could be broken down to account for example, things or how spaces are also this mediate the way our identities are ascribed, for example, by or perceived, so that we can account for those symbols that you were mentioning, like concrete tangible objects, or the way spaces are distributed, so that
yes. Your question points at the work of Sarah Ahmed, perhaps. Yeah, and the idea, because she has a very interesting notion of sexual orientation. It is not an orientation towards another person only, but it's a sexual orientation. It also refers to space and how space is signified, and that there are, for instance, there are images of the marriage of your parents on the wall, etc., which sort of mean a repetition of the heterosexual relationships, which are also which are normative also. So indeed, I would definitely think that these normative representations are also materialized in our environment. Yeah, it's not so much part of my project, but I do think it's it's a very interesting idea of Ahmed. Yeah, that not only is about interactions between people, but also is part of the space that we live in. Yeah.
And the second point, if I can do very quickly, is how would the psychoanalytic school in Slovenia from Humanities, which agrees with Butler, but at the same time says that there's a sexual difference through the formulas of sexuation from Lacan, and
Okay, yeah.
Where there's like where masculinity and femininity are quite controversially defined, but femininity becomes everything that is not this singular reference of masculinity, so that even that all bodies, even if they are perceived as masculine, are also feminized bodies, so that they are also that they are also outside of this central axis.
So, but this is it's just it holds on to this Lacanian idea of the symbolic being phallocentric. Did I understand that well?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that and it's and how does that relate to? Okay.
Yeah, no, and out of curiosity, how that would affect, since your last part was how this hermeneutic approach differs from contemporary perspective,
Yeah.
like Butler or critical phenomenology, since this current approach is building on Butler and going beyond. I was just wondering.
Yeah, so I would very much like to know more about it, and also if it's taking a distance from Lacan, because Lacan has been criticized by many feminists, as you know, from Vrije until Butler, yeah. So please tell me more about it.
All right, so I think we have to draw this session to a close. Excuses, Eva, for not being able to accommodate your question, but thanks again.
Thanks a lot for the questions.
We have a 15-minute break. There is, I think, coffee was brought in, so we reconvene in 15 minutes.
Ja, dat is heel kort hoor. Meer sowieso super interessant ook daar komt en praat van het ik lag naar de raad en ik nog steeds denken dat moet nog
Ja.
En dat je natuurlijk op twee manieren meer uit de omgeving kan halen van mogelijkheden. Dus dan kijk naar de transgender hebben we heel lang ja, als een soort van ticket tot, nou ja, maar wat jij hier over aangaf, was op het moment dat je dus dat meer de gemeenschap als samenleving ook weer dat er vaak en dus had toegang vraagt voor hoe nou dan ook ben je naar mij dat vanuit de durf niet waar het verschil in tussen meer en